This is perhaps the trigger or the most important single factor that would bring Israel and Iran to war, to a conflict that we have never seen or perceived before. What is this and what is the sign? How can we deal with this? In this video, I'll mention everything to you. But before I do that, I want you to consider subscribing to this channel if you're new here, because we talk about the Iran issue, Israel issue, Russia, Ukraine, international politics. So if you are interested in this topic, consider subscribing. So what is that sign? What is that one thing I want to mention to you that would give you a very good indication, a solid idea whether Iran and Israel will in the coming days, weeks, or months going to a war? What is that one thing I want to talk to you about in this video? We have seen many rhetoric coming from Israeli military, also from Iranian military, harsh rhetoric. Both of them are saying, we are going to get rid of you. And then the other one respond by saying, yeah, you know what? We are going to get rid of you. Tit for tat. And this is coming from Iran's military generals, and also a lot of the time from Israeli Defense Secretary Benny Gantz, including Naftali Bennett, the Prime Minister. We have seen him talking about how dangerous Iran is all the time. And this is probably what is propping him in power. Because if you are in Israel and you want to be the president, you want to win election, you want to win vote, you want to win the hearts and minds of people, the number one way perhaps is by blaming Palestine, Iran, other countries, and telling the people, look, we are at an existential threat. So vote for me, I will save you. I'm your savior. You know, those biblical prophecies that you hear all the time. This is exactly what they do. So what is that one thing I want to mention to you? What is that one indication that would make us understand or realize or get some, or gauge it, to see when this conflict can come, if they do? So this is a report that was published recently. This is not something I'm making up. I actually saw it on Israeli newspaper website. This is not coming from Iranian newspaper or US like Wall Street Journal, none of them. It is coming directly from a website, a newspaper website from Israel, and they are saying that this indication or this event could trigger a war between Iran and Israel if things go wrong. Are you ready for that? So this is the indication, and this is the thing. Excuse me for all these glitches coming right here. I'm working on it. It will be fixed. So what is an indication? Before I tell you that one thing, I want to tell you a few things, very, very important. Number one, Russia is now invading Ukraine. Okay, according to US, it is going to happen, and perhaps it is already happening right now. We do not know exactly what is happening on the ground. So Russia is going into Ukraine. Now, what US is doing, remember, US is the biggest ally of Israel. Israel has interest with who? Russia. I will explain that in a second. Israel is sitting in between US and Russia conflict, possible conflict, whether it is conflict through military or strained relationship in terms of trade, sanctioning. There are many other ways you can actually talk about this relationship between US and Russia that are being strained over this invasion of Ukraine. So Israel is sitting in the middle. Israel needs both US and Russia. Israel in the middle, they need both US and Russia. They cannot sell their war propaganda without one of them. They have to have both of them. Okay, so Israel is going to be finding itself in a very awkward situation if US imposes sanction against Russia. Why? Because then Russia will say to Israel, oh, you guys are buddies with US. Why should I help you? Where Russia can help Israel. You get the point. They can help Israel. Russia can help Israel in Syria. This is something very, very important for Israel. In recent weeks and months, we have seen how Israel is spending millions of dollars perhaps just to carry out some airstrike on the Iranian proxies like Hezbollah and many other proxies in Syria and also in Lebanon, but mainly in Syria. Now, Syrian airspace is being controlled by who? Most of it, not all of it, most of it by who? Russia. If Israel is denied access by Russia into Syrian airspace, that means Israel cannot go into Syria to carry out those strikes that are very, very important, very, very, very vital for Israel. Because if Hezbollah is breathing in and close to Syria-Israel border, then you understand that Hezbollah is going to lose all hell on Israel. Why? Because they are being supported by Iran. Iran is providing them with drones, missiles, everything, logistics, intelligence, money, everything. In case something happens, Hezbollah and the other proxies in that region, Iranian proxies, they are going to strike Israel by sending drones and whatnot. And Israel will be entitled. Okay, they will be in big trouble. So Israel, they must go into Syria to carry out this airstrike. They cannot do it if Russia says, we are not going to give you access. Right now they're doing it very selective. They're convincing Russia that, look, we are not doing anything against Bashar al-Assad. It is just those proxies we're targeting. But things will get much worse if Russia denies and if Russia is under sanctions. So let's talk about the sanctions. So US is saying, okay, we're going to sanction you, Russia. Russia is then retaliating US, not by just imposing sanction on US officials, but also they could retaliate through Israel by saying to Israel, we are not in good terms anymore because of what US is doing. Our economy is hurting and we do not know the extent of these sanctions. Whether Russia can withstand these sanctions or not, this is something very, very important for us to know, and we'll see in the coming days when US will impose sanctions against Russia. Once Russia says no to Israel and retaliate that way against US, then Iran would have a permanent and solid and much stronger base in Syria. And going back to my point, the biggest indication that a war between or conflict between, I should not use the word war because I don't think anybody wants to go to war, but let's use the word conflict. So Iran will go to Syria, have a solid base, a stronger base, even perhaps military base, who knows, because Russia is saying, yeah, we're going to support you because Israel is with US and we do not want to support them. Then Iran will launch attacks directly, not just through proxies, but directly against Israel. And that would bring these two nations, Iran and Israel, to a major conflict. That would also mean Russia is getting involved directly or indirectly, because you cannot fight in Syria without, as a country, I'm not saying militia or things like that. No, I'm talking about as a country. You cannot, Iran or Israel cannot fight in Syria with each other without having Russia involved in it. Period. Russia is going to involve. Why? Because you cannot think about Syria without Russia anymore. This is Russia. Syria is Russia. 90%. Not all of it, 90%. So attacking Syria without Russia's permission means you are targeting Russian authority. You are challenging their authority. You're challenging their ability, their to control the airspace. If Russia doesn't do anything, then other countries will project Russia as weak country, and they are in Syria just as a puppet, doing really nothing. So Russia wouldn't want that to happen. Russia is going to get involved, and especially under Putin, he is not going to spare anybody. This is the sign that Iran and Israel is probably coming to a conflict. Depending on the situation of Russia and Ukraine, we will see how much sanctions US can impose and how Russia will respond to those sanctions. New here, consider subscribing. I will see you in the next one. Have a wonderful day.